In this video, I'm going to take a look at the difference between Entity Framework in .NET Framework and Entity Framework in .NET Core, and also I'm going to take a look back at the predecessor to Entity Framework, which was LINQ-to-SQL, which was a thing back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, 2009, 10, 11, that period. For the database, I have a very simple database, and what this database does is it tracks all of the files on your computer by their name and the date and size, that kind of information, and stores it in a Microsoft SQL Server database. And it turns out this is actually really convenient. I actually use this a lot. It's a lot easier to find files on your computer when you can just write a database query. Of course, you have to update it on a regular basis, and that takes some time to do all the inserts depending on how many files you have. But I found this a very convenient thing to use, and it's a good example for this little look into Entity Framework. So here we are looking at the table structure in the .NET Framework Entity Framework Designer. So we have a table for the drive letters, just all of the drive letters on your computer. We have a table for file, and here you can see the different properties. We have a table for folders, so this is all of the folders on your computer, and every file is in a folder. And we have a table for the root folders, and this is the top level folder on each drive. And you might wonder why this is necessary. It's not exactly necessary, but it turns out it's convenient because many times you might know that a file is in a specific root folder, and it makes it a little easier to do the queries that way. And then finally, there is a table for exception logs. This is for the tool that scans all of the files and collects all this data. If there's any errors, it just writes it to this log file and then moves on. Basically ignores the error and moves on. Here is the database file tracker in SQL Server. And one thing to note is that there is a view, file and folder view, which is basically a join of the file and folders table, just for convenience. But one thing to note is the view itself does not appear in the diagram. And that is one of the advantages of the diagram, is you can add and remove tables or references to tables as you wish. I have 3 different projects in this solution. This project is the .NET Framework project. This project is the .NET Core project. And this project is the .NET Framework using LINQ-to-SQL, the predecessor to Entity Framework. So going back and looking at the .NET Framework version for Entity Framework, we have the EDMX file, which has created all of our entities, such as a file CS class, and you can see what that looks like here. File entities is empty. Designer, just comments. And everything is generated using a TT file, which runs and generates the code for you. I have a data access class. And this is just pretty simple. It's just a class with a bunch of static methods using the context to get various things. I get the number, I get a list of the drives. I can delete a folder by executing a command, and I'm going to come back and talk about this a little bit more. But this is how you would actually execute a SQL command. So going back and looking at the database, I actually have these stored procedures. This stored procedure, set file is deleted, just sets a flag to indicate that the file is deleted. It doesn't actually delete the record. So the way that you execute a stored procedure, going back here, is this context database execute SQL command. And here's the command that we're going to execute. Here, where we handle an exception, is where we're going to insert to the exception log. So this is an example of how you do an insert in Entity Framework. We're going to create our log item, add it to the context, and then call context save changes. Let's compare that to Entity Framework Core. So in Entity Framework Core, there's sort of a naming problem that they have, whether you're doing database first or code first development for your database. And that's really a misnomer. In this case, we have the database, but we're doing what's called code first development because there is no designer. They really kind of named it wrong. So the database does exist first, but the only way you can create the entities is through the command line because, as I said, there is no designer. So here is our command line. And there's a number of options. You're going to want to Google that and see what kind of options you need. And then here are some other things that we need to install. We need to have a tool to install the .NET Entity Framework. We need to add these packages. And that is all before we run the command line utility. Once we run the command line utility, it creates entities for each of our tables. For example, here is the file table. Let's look at the data access. On the left, we have the core entity framework, and on the right, we have the framework entity framework. And they're very similar. One of the differences is where we're going to execute an SQL statement. And this in .NET Core was kind of a moving target. This thing changed over the various .NET versions. So whatever version you're looking at, it might be different than what this version is. And here it's .NET 7. So what in .NET Framework was called execute SQL command is now called execute SQL raw in Core. And that has changed over the different versions. And this is .NET Core version 7, as I mentioned. We can go down and look at handle exception, and we can see that the code here is basically the same, if not exactly the same. If you were going from .NET Framework to .NET Core, in this particular case, this code was pretty easy to migrate. I think all I had to do was change the execute SQL statement, and I could have just written an extension that handled that to simplify that if I didn't want to make the code changes. I think it's worth emphasizing this once again because it's such a weird naming thing. .NET Core calls this code first design, but we have the database already and it's in its final form, and we are generating the code from the database. The difference is that we generated all of the code from a command line, and we do not have a designer like we do in .NET Framework. Now, just for some historical context, let's go back and see the predecessor to Entity Framework, which was LINQ-to-SQL, and that's LINQ, LINQ-to-SQL. And here, once again, we use a command line utility to generate all of our entities. So .NET Core has basically taken us back to LINQ-to-SQL, where we're using a command line utility to generate the entities, and there is no designer. However, there are some other differences. All of my entities and the context are in one single file. In this case, I call it file tracker link, and I specify that in the command line. And as you scroll down through here, you can just see all of your entities. For example, my exception log entity here. My file entity here. And all of their associated methods and properties. Here we can look at my data access class. On the left is the .NET Core version, and on the right is the LINQ-to-SQL version. The first thing that is noticeable in the LINQ-to-SQL version is the constructor for the context accepts a connection string as a parameter, whereas that is not true in the Entity Framework version. Here we can scroll down and look at in Core, our execute SQL raw statement is just called execute command in LINQ-to-SQL. And then finally, we're going to look at the handle exception. And in Entity Framework, this is how you add new entities to a table. You call add and then you call context.savechanges. In LINQ-to-SQL, they called it insert on submit to insert a new record into a table or row into a table, and then context.submitChanges. So that was a little bit of a variation. I did a lot of projects with LINQ-to-SQL, and then as I had to move to Entity Framework, I had to get used to that change of what they called these things. So it took a little bit of a learning curve for me to adapt. But that's it. I wanted to give an overview of .NET Core Entity Framework versus Framework, Entity Framework, and then the LINQ-to-SQL is just for a little historical context. There's not really any reason you would want to use that now. Entity Framework is so much better. Not really anything wrong with LINQ-to-SQL, but it's just been superseded by the newer technologies. So I hope you found the video helpful.